The convoy rumbled across the vast, sunburnt plains of Texas, trucks coated in red dust that clung to every surface like memory. The air shimmered above the asphalt, heavy with heat and the scent of mesquite. Inside one of the trucks sat Friedrich Fritz Weber, his uniform faded, his thoughts louder than the rattling engine. He had been a student of architecture in Dresden before the war devoured his youth. Now his hands were bound not by chains, but by exhaustion and disbelief. The driver, an American with a sunburned neck, chewed gum with the rhythm of a man who'd never seen Europe, never cared to. Outside, the horizon seemed endless. No ruins, no smoke, no fear, only land stretching forever. Fritz squinted at the sky and thought, "This can't be real, this can't be where prisoners are sent." When the truck stopped, the soldiers ordered the men out. The heat struck him like a hammer. He blinked hard, adjusting to the blinding light. Beyond the barbed wire stood a collection of wooden barracks, guard towers, and, surprisingly, flower beds. Camp Hearn. "Welcome to Texas, boys," one of the guards called out, not unkindly. The other men around Fritz murmured in disbelief. The word Texas carried an almost mythical sound. Cowboys, open plains, and a kind of freedom he'd never known. Before we go deeper into this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more powerful tales like this one. Fritz followed the line toward the registration tent. The guards didn't shout much, and their rifles stayed pointed down. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He'd expected hatred, humiliation, maybe even revenge. Instead, the Americans seemed casual. One handed him a canteen of water, nodding when he muttered a quiet, "Danke." Inside the barracks, the air smelled of pine boards and soap. Cots were lined neatly, sunlight falling across them like soft gold. A few prisoners were already there, some reading, some playing cards. One man looked up and grinned. "New arrivals, huh? You'll get used to it." Fritz sat on the edge of a cot, staring at the wall. Used to it? How could one get used to captivity? He thought of Dresden, the Elbe River, his mother's voice, the last letter he'd received months ago. His chest tightened. Later, during the evening meal, he tasted something foreign, yet oddly comforting. Cornbread and beans. He'd never eaten anything like it. The guards chatted nearby, laughter breaking through the hum of cicadas. One of them wore a wide-brimmed hat and boots that gleamed in the dim light. Fritz whispered to himself, almost amused, "So they really dress like that." When the lights dimmed, he lay awake listening to the sounds of Texas. Crickets, a distant dog, the wind slipping through the wire fence. There was no bombing, no orders shouted through smoke, no trembling ground. Only the heavy stillness of a place too peaceful for war. Sleep came slowly, bringing dreams of home and a question that wouldn't leave him. How could an enemy treat him this humanely? Outside, the guard's radio murmured a tune he didn't recognize, something slow, full of longing. The stars above the camp glowed brighter than any Fritz had seen in Europe, as if Texas itself was daring him to rethink everything he believed about enemies, mercy, and freedom. He turned toward the window, eyes open to the dark, and whispered, "What kind of place is this?" Morning came sharp and golden, the Texas sun already fierce before most men stirred. Fritz awoke to the distant clang of a bell and the smell of breakfast. Eggs, coffee, something fried. The air inside the barracks was warm, full of quiet movement. Boots scuffing, murmured German, the occasional cough. He sat up slowly, still uncertain how to exist in this strange calm. Outside, the camp stretched wide and ordered. Barbed wire enclosed it, but beyond that glittered fields of dry grass and endless sky. Fritz had never seen so much open space. In Germany, walls and buildings pressed close, but here the horizon had no edge. He walked toward the mess hall, his boots crunching on gravel. "Not what you expected, huh?" a voice said beside him. It was Jürgen Falk, the man from the barracks who'd smiled the day before. His hair was the color of straw, and his accent faintly Bavarian. "They treat us better than we treated each other back home," Jürgen added with a crooked grin. Fritz managed a smile but said nothing. The truth was he didn't know what to feel. He had been told the Americans were monsters, soulless, greedy, without discipline. Yet the guard who handed him coffee nodded like an old friend. In the corner sat Otto Kraus, a heavy man with a jaw like carved stone. He spoke loudly, lecturing a small group of men. "Don't let their kindness fool you," Otto said. "It's all part of their propaganda. They want to break our pride." His tone carried authority, the kind that silenced conversation. Fritz recognized it instantly, the same voice that had ordered men to dig trenches in North Africa without water. After breakfast, the men were assigned to work details. Fritz joined a crew clearing debris near the vegetable garden. The soil was hard, the sun brutal, yet the work was steady and fair. A guard watched from the shade, humming a country tune. When Fritz paused to wipe sweat from his brow, the guard tossed him a canteen. "Keep hydrated, partner," he said. The word partner caught Fritz off guard. During the midday break, Jürgen sat beside him under a patch of shade. "You ever seen a sky this big?" he asked. Fritz shook his head. In Dresden, the sky was a rectangle between rooftops. "Here it feels like it could swallow us," Jürgen chuckled. "Maybe that's what freedom looks like." Fritz didn't reply, but his mind lingered on the thought. Freedom. What a fragile, shifting word. Inside the wire, he was not free. Yet somehow, breathing that dry, endless air, he felt less trapped than he had in months. When the guards called an end to the day's work, the men returned to the barracks. Fritz noticed laughter among some of the prisoners, real laughter, not the bitter kind born of survival. Someone had fashioned a makeshift chessboard from cardboard. Music drifted from a nearby hut, a harmonica, soft and wistful. Lying in his cot that evening, Fritz stared at the wooden ceiling and listened. There were no explosions, no sirens, no rumble of aircraft, only the low murmur of conversation, the whisper of the Texas wind sliding past the wire. He wondered what the Americans thought of them, if they pitied them, or simply saw them as men who'd lost their way. As sleep approached, Fritz's last thought was simple and sharp. Perhaps the war feels different when the enemy treats you like a man instead of a monster. Days slipped into a rhythm, and Fritz found himself adapting almost unwillingly. The sun rose early, painting the barracks in amber, and the smell of coffee mixed with the dry scent of dust and wood. Work, meals, rest, each moment threaded together like beads on a wire. But what truly puzzled him wasn't the schedule, it was the Americans themselves. They were unlike anything he had been taught. The guards joked with each other, sang off-key, and sometimes shared cigarettes with prisoners. One afternoon, while Fritz was stacking lumber near the carpentry shed, a guard with sandy hair and a lazy smile approached. "You the one who used to draw buildings?" the man asked in slow English. Fritz hesitated, then nodded. "Architecture, before the war." The guard grinned. "Name's Tom Bailey. My uncle builds barns near Brenham." "You'd like those, ugly as sin but still standing after 50 summers." He laughed easily, as though the barbed wire meant nothing between them. Fritz's English was halting, but he caught the warmth behind the words. "In Germany, barns do not survive 50 summers," he said carefully. Tom laughed again, clapping him on the shoulder. "Guess Texas wood's tougher than it looks." Later, back in the barracks, Otto Kraus noticed. "You're getting too friendly with them," he muttered. "Remember who they are." His voice carried that same cold authority Fritz had learned to obey. "They want to make us soft. Don't fall for it." Fritz looked at him, the anger rising quietly. "They gave us food, water, books. If this is their plan to destroy us, it's a strange one." Otto's eyes hardened. "You sound like one of them already." That night, Fritz couldn't sleep. The barracks was dim, lit only by the sliver of moon through the window. Jürgen whispered from the next cot, "Don't listen to Otto. He needs enemies to remember who he is." Fritz turned over. "Maybe he's right," he said softly. "Maybe I'm forgetting something I shouldn't. Or maybe," Jürgen replied, "you're remembering something you were supposed to forget." The next morning, Fritz went to the camp library, an old wooden room filled with donated American books. The librarian, a woman from town, smiled kindly. "You're Fritz Weber." "Sergeant Bailey said you might come." She handed him a small English grammar book and a copy of Huckleberry Finn. "Start with these," she said. He studied in the evenings, tracing the rhythm of the language, the odd humor of the words. Freedom, kindness, trust. They sounded simple in English, yet so difficult in practice. Weeks passed, and Fritz's English improved enough to talk with Tom during work hours. "You folks sure like rules," Tom teased one day. "Everything's got an order." "In war, order keeps men alive," Fritz replied. "Maybe," Tom said, "but out here, a little chaos keeps a man honest." Fritz didn't understand then, but the sentence lingered. Texas was chaos, wild, open, unpredictable, and yet somehow it felt more honest than the rigid world he'd known. That night, he wrote a single sentence in his notebook, struggling with the words, "Perhaps they are not my enemies, but a different kind of people with the same kind of heart." Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, echoing across the plains. Fritz closed his notebook and stared into the darkness, wondering what kind of man he would be when the wire was gone. The mail arrived on a dry, windless afternoon. A soldier in khaki stepped into the yard with a small canvas sack and called names in a heavy southern drawl. The prisoners gathered close, pretending not to care, but their eyes betrayed them. Letters meant proof of life, a thread to a world that felt more like a dream each day. "Friedrich Weber," the soldier shouted. Fritz's hand shot up before his name had finished echoing. The envelope was thin, marked with foreign stamps and the trembling handwriting of his mother. His chest tightened as he stepped back from the crowd. Inside the barracks, he unfolded the letter with careful hands. The words blurred for a moment before he blinked them into focus. His mother wrote about the ruins of Dresden, about how the river smelled of smoke and iron. She mentioned that his father's workshop was gone, that neighbors had vanished, and that the city no longer looked like a city at all. "We are alive," she wrote, "but nothing feels like home." Fritz read the line again and again. He wanted to cry, but no tears came. There was only a hollow ache in his chest and the sound of the wind scraping against the barrack walls. Jürgen noticed the letter and spoke gently. "Bad news?" "Just truth," Fritz said, "and truth can hurt worse than lies." That night, Otto Kraus gathered a few men near the end of the barracks. His tone was sharp, his words laced with bitterness. "You see? They destroy our homes and then feed us like pets. Don't forget who caused this." Fritz folded his letter carefully, refusing to meet Otto's eyes. The anger that had once fueled him had burned away, leaving only fatigue. "War destroyed my home," he said quietly. "Not these men." Otto glared at him, but before he could reply, Jürgen cut in. "Enough. The letter is from his mother, not your propaganda sheet." Otto muttered something under his breath and walked away, his boots striking the floor like hammers. In the following days, Fritz threw himself into learning English. Tom Bailey brought him an old grammar workbook and a pocket dictionary. "You'll need this if you ever want to read Mark Twain," Tom joked. Fritz smiled faintly. "Maybe I'll design a library for him someday," Tom chuckled. "Now that's a thought, Huck Finn in a German library." They worked side by side repairing a broken fence post. Fritz's hands, once used for drawing lines on paper, now gripped rough splinters and calloused wood. Yet something about the physical work grounded him. It gave him shape when his world felt formless. At night, he reread his mother's letter. Her words reminded him of fragility and of the quiet strength buried beneath it. She hadn't begged for pity. She'd simply written, "Be kind if you can. Hate only grows where it's fed." Fritz closed his eyes, repeating that line until it echoed inside him. Kindness, even here. Especially here. Perhaps that was what survival meant now. As he drifted toward sleep, he realized he no longer saw the Americans as symbols of victory or defeat. They were simply men. Different language, same hunger for peace. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the faintest pulse of gratitude that he couldn't yet explain. The announcement came during roll call just after sunrise. The American sergeant stood before the gathered prisoners, his clipboard tucked under one arm, his smile easy and unhurried. "Listen up, fellas," he said. "Next week, we're having ourselves a little summer cookout. Food, music, maybe a game or two. You'll get a chance to relax a bit. We'll be grilling real Texas barbecue." A ripple of murmurs spread through the line. Fritz wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. A cookout for prisoners. He exchanged glances with Jürgen, who raised an eyebrow, half amused, half disbelieving. When the sergeant finished, Otto Kraus stepped forward, his voice low but heavy with scorn. "A celebration while our country burns? They mock us." His words carried the bitterness of someone who couldn't stand to see others smile. Fritz stayed quiet. Something about the idea intrigued him. A barbecue. He had read the word once in an English book Tom gave him. He imagined smoke curling into the blue Texas sky, meat sizzling over open fire, laughter that didn't sound forced. Could such a thing exist here behind the wire? Later, while working in the garden, Fritz brought it up. "Do you think they're serious about this barbecue?" Jürgen wiped his forehead. "Oh, they're serious. Americans celebrate everything. Birthdays, Sundays, even being bored." He grinned. "You'll see. They'll turn the camp into a fairground." Fritz smiled faintly, but a strange nervousness prickled beneath his calm. He wanted to understand the point of it. Was it kindness or strategy? Pity or pride? That evening, Tom Bailey stopped by the fence line where Fritz was sketching in his notebook. "You hear about the barbecue?" Tom asked, his voice carrying that lazy Texas rhythm. "Yes," Fritz said, choosing his words carefully. "You celebrate summer?" Tom chuckled. "You could say that. Mostly we just like an excuse to fire up the pit." "Ain't much better than good meat and bad singing." Fritz looked up from his drawing. "Why invite us?" Tom hesitated, then shrugged. "Because you're here. Because maybe it's good for everyone to remember we're still people." That answer lingered in Fritz's mind long after Tom walked away. Still people. It sounded too simple to be true, and yet, what if it was? In the barracks, Otto gathered a few men and spoke in harsh whispers. "It's a trick. They want us docile, obedient. Don't let them humiliate you." One of the younger prisoners, Hans, frowned. "But what harm is there in eating?" Otto slammed his hand on the table. "You think it's about food? It's about dignity." Fritz felt the room tighten around Otto's anger, but he refused to be swept into it. He looked at Jürgen instead. "Maybe dignity is also knowing when not to hate," he said quietly. That night, he lay awake listening to the distant murmur of the guards talking outside. Somewhere, a radio played a faint tune, country music, rough and slow but oddly comforting. He imagined smoke, laughter, the crackle of fire. Something was stirring inside him, a curiosity that felt dangerous. If the Americans could treat them like men, perhaps he could allow himself to see them that way too. He turned toward the window, the horizon glowing faintly beneath the stars. "Barbecue," he whispered, tasting the word like a secret. "Maybe I'll see what that means." The camp buzzed with unusual energy. For days, the guards and prisoners worked side by side to prepare for the coming barbecue. Tables were scrubbed, benches repaired, and long lines of bunting hung between the barracks. Even the barbed wire looked less menacing beneath the wide Texas sun. Fritz walked across the yard, his sleeves rolled up, helping carry wooden planks for new tables. The heat pressed down like an invisible hand, and the air shimmered with dust. Sweat ran down his back, but he didn't mind. There was something strange, almost peaceful in the rhythm of shared work. Tom Bailey approached with his hat tilted low, a hammer in hand. His boots were scuffed, his shirt rolled to the elbows. "You ever built furniture before?" he asked, grinning. "Only models," Fritz replied, squinting at the structure they were assembling. "In school, we built miniature houses." Tom laughed. "Well, this one won't be miniature, partner. Texans don't do small." The word partner again, it always disarmed him. Fritz found himself smiling before he realized it. He noticed the way Tom moved, confident but unhurried, like the world would wait for him. He carried himself with a kind of ease that Fritz had never seen in an officer or a worker. It was freedom, tangible and maddening. Across the yard, Otto Kraus glared. Fritz could feel his stare like a nail pressed against his skin. Otto leaned close to a group of men, whispering harshly. Whatever he said made them glance toward the Americans with tight, uncertain faces. Jürgen joined Fritz, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's spreading poison again," he muttered. "Says the barbecue is a trick. Says those who go are traitors." Fritz sighed. He's afraid. Maybe that's all he knows how to be. Fear's contagious, Jürgen replied. Best wash your hands after hearing him. That night, the prisoners were given extra rations of flour and sugar to bake bread for the event. In the kitchen hut, the air was thick with the scent of yeast and wood smoke. Fritz helped knead dough beside Hans, the young mechanic. I heard they'll play music, Hans said, his eyes bright with curiosity. Real American songs. Fritz smiled faintly. Maybe even guitars. Tom says everyone sings, even those who shouldn't. Hans laughed, and for a fleeting moment it felt like they weren't prisoners at all. Later, walking back to the barracks, Fritz passed a guard polishing his boots near the tower. The leather gleamed under the fading light, rich and brown. Fritz paused, remembering the first time he had seen such boots on Tom. They seemed symbolic, sturdy, self-made, worn by people who stood firmly on their own land. Behind him, Otto's voice cut through the quiet. You're forgetting who you are, Weber. Don't let them buy your respect with a piece of meat and a smile. Fritz turned. Respect isn't bought, Otto. It's recognized. Otto sneered. That's how weakness begins. Fritz walked away before answering. He didn't trust his own voice. The sky above him was streaked with the last traces of orange, the smell of freshly cut wood hanging in the air. Tomorrow they would finish building the tables. The day after, the Americans would bring the grills. Fritz wondered what it would all look like. The smoke, the laughter, the taste of something he'd never known. He felt the faint tremor of anticipation and whispered to himself, maybe I'll finally understand what they mean by Texas. The morning of the barbecue broke warm and cloudless, the kind of Texas day that made the air shimmer before noon. The camp was alive with motion, guards setting up long metal grills, prisoners arranging tables, and the unmistakable smell of smoke drifting across the yard. Fritz inhaled deeply. The scent was thick and strange, sweet and sharp at once, like nothing he had ever known. Tom Bailey waved from near the pit, a bandana tied around his neck. You ready, partner? He called out over the chatter. Hope you brought an appetite. We've got brisket, sausage, corn, and more beans than a man can count. Fritz smiled awkwardly. I will try everything, he said, his accent soft but clear. You better, Tom laughed. We don't waste good smoke in Texas. The prisoners gathered, cautious but curious. Some stood back, arms crossed, waiting to see if it was a trick. Others, like Jürgen and Hans, lined up near the tables, following the smell of sizzling meat. The guards were relaxed, their rifles slung casually, their laughter genuine. The sound of a guitar drifted through the air, a slow, rolling tune that seemed to melt the tension. Fritz accepted a tin plate from Tom. On it sat slices of brisket glistening with sauce, baked beans, and a slab of cornbread. He hesitated, fork in hand, his stomach twisting with equal parts hunger and disbelief. From a nearby table, Otto's voice cut through the hum. Enjoying your reward, Weber? His tone was sharp as barbed wire. Eating with your captors now? Fritz looked up but said nothing. Jürgen leaned toward Otto, his patience thinning. He's eating food, not politics, he said. Maybe you should try it. Might make you human again. A few men chuckled quietly, though fear kept their laughter brief. Otto glared but turned away, muttering. Fritz took his first bite. The meat was smoky and tender, rich with spices that stung his tongue and warmed his chest. For a moment, the world around him dissolved. The barbed wire, the towers, the uniforms. He tasted the open fire, the wood, the patient hands that had cooked it. Tom grinned from across the table. So? How's it sit with you? Fritz swallowed slowly. Do cowboys really eat like this? He asked, almost whispering the words. Tom burst out laughing. You bet they do. Every Sunday if they can. Something inside Fritz cracked then. Not pain, not guilt, but an unfamiliar release. He laughed too, softly at first, then louder. It felt strange, like stretching a muscle he'd forgotten existed. The afternoon carried on with easy rhythm. Prisoners and guards traded jokes, shared bread, and passed jugs of lemonade. The guitar picked up speed, joined by clapping and the thump of boots on dirt. Even the air seemed lighter. Yet beneath the laughter, Fritz sensed the eyes of those who disapproved. men like Otto whose silence burned hotter than the fire. They stood apart, watching, holding on to their hatred like it was all they had left. As the sun began to dip low, the smell of smoke lingered, wrapping the camp in a haze of warmth and unease. Fritz looked around at the tables, the faces, the fading light. For the first time since arriving, he felt both free and guilty for feeling that way. He didn't know yet what this moment meant, but something irreversible had begun. The first taste stayed with him long after he swallowed. The smoky sweetness of the brisket, the tang of the sauce, the tender grain of the meat. It was unlike anything Fritz had ever known. He stared at his plate, half expecting the flavor to vanish like a dream, but it didn't. It lingered, bold and real, as though it had been waiting his whole life to be discovered. All around him, laughter rippled through the air. The guitar strummed faster now, the melody rising and falling like the heat itself. Fritz leaned back on the bench, feeling something close to contentment, though he didn't dare name it. Jürgen sat beside him, chewing thoughtfully. "Not bad, huh?" he said between bites. "Not bad," Fritz agreed softly. "It tastes honest." "Honest?" Jürgen grinned. "Only a German would say food is honest." Fritz smiled, but the word stuck with him. Honest. That was it. The food, the smoke, the laughter. It all felt unpretentious, without strategy. For once, no one demanded allegiance or fear. He was simply a man eating among men. Across the yard, Tom Bailey raised a plate high. "Y'all ever had a real Texas brisket before?" he called out. A few prisoners shook their heads. Others laughed uncertainly. "Then today," Tom continued, "you're Texans too." The words drew cheers from some of the Americans, but for the prisoners it was met with silence. Yet even in that silence something shifted. A few of the men smiled. Others lowered their gaze, uncomfortable with the warmth in Tom's voice. Fritz watched him, studying the easy posture, the unforced kindness. Tom wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply believed in sharing what he had. That, Fritz realized, was what made him so different. Otto Kraus stood apart, arms crossed, his face tight with fury. His eyes met Fritz's for a moment, full of accusation. Fritz looked away. He no longer felt the sharp sting of Otto's judgment, only pity. When the plates were cleared and the sun began to fall, Tom came over with 2 tin cups of sweet tea. "You survived the Texas barbecue," he said with a grin. "So how's your verdict?" Fritz took the cup. The tea was cold, sticky, and sweet enough to make him wince. "It's strong," he said. Tom laughed. "That's what we like. Strong food, strong people, strong coffee too." "I think I understand now," Fritz said, his voice thoughtful. "It's not about the food, it's about the sharing." Tom nodded slowly. "You got it, partner." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the last curl of smoke fade into the sky. The air had cooled, the laughter had softened, and Fritz could almost pretend the war didn't exist beyond the wire. Then, from across the yard, Otto's voice rang out again. "Don't forget who you are," he shouted. "They'll use your smiles against you." Tom frowned slightly but said nothing. Fritz turned his gaze toward Otto, his voice steady. "Maybe," he said. "They'll use them to remember we're not enemies." Otto shook his head and walked away, swallowed by the shadows of the barracks. Fritz finished his tea in silence. The taste of smoke and sugar clung to his tongue, mingling with the faint ache in his chest. Something inside him had cracked, not broken, but opened. That night, as the stars burned fiercely above the Texas plains, Fritz whispered to himself, "If kindness can survive war, maybe so can I." That night, the air still carried the faint scent of smoke and spice, but the warmth of the day had turned uneasy. The barbecue had ended hours ago, yet whispers moved through the barracks like wind through grass, quiet, tense, full of warning. Fritz sat on his cot, turning a dull metal cup in his hands, his mind replaying the laughter, the taste, the brief peace he'd felt. It had been real. He knew it had. But peace never came without consequence. Otto Kraus stood at the far end of the room, his face lit by the weak glow of a lantern. "Do you all see what's happening?" he said, his voice calm but poisonous. "They're softening us." They feed us, flatter us, make us forget who we are. Next, we'll thank them for winning the war." No one spoke. The quiet that followed was heavier than any shout. Jürgen finally stood, his tone measured. "You're wrong, Otto. They didn't feed us to make us forget. They did it because not everyone lives by hate." Otto's eyes flashed. "You think kindness erases what they've done, what they've burned, what they've taken from our families?" Fritz's chest tightened. The memory of his mother's letter surfaced. The ruins of Dresden, the pain she'd hidden between her lines. He swallowed hard. "No," he said softly. "Kindness doesn't erase it, but hate won't rebuild it either." The barracks fell silent. Otto stepped closer, his boots thudding on the floorboards. "You're a fool, Weber. You think sharing food makes you brothers. You're a disgrace to your uniform." Fritz rose slowly, meeting his stare. "That uniform was buried with the world we lost," he said. "All that's left now is what we choose to be." The air snapped with tension. For a moment it seemed Otto might strike him. Instead he spat on the floor and turned away. "You'll regret this weakness," he muttered, disappearing into the shadows. Jürgen exhaled. "He's dangerous," he said quietly. "He's been talking to others, spreading fear." "I know," Fritz replied. "But fear only grows if we feed it." Neither spoke again. The lamps dimmed one by one and the barracks fell into uneasy sleep. But Fritz couldn't close his eyes. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind against the boards, sounded like Otto's footsteps returning. He reached for the small notebook under his pillow and began to write, the words forming slowly, each one a fragile defiance. "I don't know what tomorrow will be, but today I saw laughter where hate was supposed to live." He stopped, staring at the page. His hands trembled. The thought that such a simple act, sharing food, could ignite both hope and fury among men trapped together was almost unbearable. It wasn't the Americans dividing them. It was the war still echoing inside their bones. Outside, the moon was pale and distant, a thin ghost above the camp. Somewhere a coyote howled, its cry sharp and lonely. Fritz set the notebook aside and sat in the dark, his pulse slow but steady. He knew Otto's anger wouldn't fade easily. Something was coming, something that would test more than his beliefs. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Let it come. I'm done living afraid." But as he lay down, the smell of smoke from the barbecue still lingered in the air, blending with the sour trace of tension. The sweetness of the day had burned away, leaving only embers and the quiet dread of what would rise from them next. The morning after the confrontation dawned grey and still, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. A faint fog hung over the camp, muting the sharp edges of the fences and towers. Fritz rose early, his body weary but his mind alert, the memory of Otto's words echoing like a bad dream. The barbecue's warmth had turned to silence. Men avoided one another's eyes, moving quietly through their routines. Fritz joined the work detail, mending fences along the perimeter. The ground was soft from dew, the posts rough beneath his palms. The rhythm of hammering steadied him, a small simple act that pushed thought aside. He felt the weight of unease around him, but kept his focus on the work. Tom Bailey arrived mid-morning, leaning against the fence with his usual easy grin. "You're out early," he said. "Didn't think anyone would be this eager to fix fences after all that eating yesterday." Fritz managed a small smile. "The fence keeps us busy," he replied, "and being busy keeps us calm." Tom tilted his head. "You sound like my old man. He used to say work's just another kind of prayer." Fritz paused, the thought settling in. Maybe he was right. Tom handed him a canteen. "Here. You look like you're thinking too much again." As he drank, Fritz studied him, the dust on his boots, the faint sunburn on his neck, the quiet sincerity that never seemed to waver. The man didn't act like a soldier. He acted like someone who believed in fixing things, even when they weren't broken. "You worry about what comes next?" Fritz asked suddenly. Tom shrugged. "Don't see much use in worrying. War's got a way of ending when men get tired enough of it. Till then, we just keep swinging the hammer." The simplicity of that answer struck Fritz harder than he expected. He nodded slowly. "I wish it were that easy." Tom gave him a half-smile. Maybe it is, partner. Maybe it's just folks making it harder than it needs to be. The afternoon wore on in quiet cooperation. Fritz found himself helping one of the guards repair a section of the chicken coop, laughing briefly when a rooster strutted too close and nearly knocked over a bucket. It felt absurd and human all at once, laughter in a place built for confinement. When the bell rang for evening meal, a whisper spread. Otto Kraus had been transferred to another compound. The reason wasn't spoken aloud, but everyone knew. The officers had grown tired of his agitation, his divisions, his endless rage. Fritz felt no triumph, only relief. The camp seemed to exhale with him. That night, Jürgen sat beside him on the barrack steps, their breath misting in the cool air. "He's gone," Jürgen said quietly. "Do you think it'll be peaceful now?" Fritz stared through the wire at the distant trees. "Peace doesn't come because one man leaves," he said, "but maybe it starts there." For the first time in weeks, the barracks slept without argument. Fritz lay awake, listening to the chirp of crickets, the creak of boards settling. Somewhere beyond the fence, a train whistle echoed, faint and far away. He imagined it heading home, to a city he no longer recognized, to faces he might never see again. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "One day I'll build again." Weeks passed, and the air in Camp Herne grew softer with spring. The winds carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and distant rain, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee that always seemed to linger around the mess hall. Life settled into a rhythm again, but something fundamental had shifted. The men no longer spoke of escape. They spoke of after the war, after the wire, after the world remembered how to breathe. Fritz sat by the fence most evenings now, a small notebook balanced on his knee. His English had improved enough to read the newspapers the guards left behind. The headlines spoke of Allied victories, advancing fronts, cities freed, and cities destroyed. Every story felt like a thread tying him both to hope and guilt. One afternoon, Tom Bailey approached with a folded newspaper in hand. "How are you keeping up with the news?" he asked. Fritz nodded. "Sometimes it feels like reading about ghosts." Tom lowered himself onto the ground beside him, the paper rustling softly. "You're not wrong. Every line's got someone's story buried in it." Fritz studied the print. "They say the Allies reached the Rhine. That means that maybe Dresden too." Tom glanced at him. "That your home?" Fritz's throat tightened. It was. For a moment neither spoke. The breeze moved through the fence, rattling the wire like a whisper. "You ever think about what comes after?" Tom asked finally. "Every day," Fritz said. "But I don't know if there's a place for us. We've seen too much, believed too much. When I go home, if I go home, what will I build on ruins?" Tom smiled faintly. "You start small, one wall at a time. My granddad used to say if a man can build something straight with his hands, maybe his heart will follow." The simplicity of it stung Fritz more than he expected. He closed the notebook and said quietly, "In Germany, we build to endure. In America, you build to live." Tom laughed softly. Maybe that's the only difference that ever mattered. Later that week, a few Italian prisoners joined their work group. They were lively men, quick to laugh, even quicker to sing. Fritz found their resilience confusing at first. One of them, Marco, winked and said, "War ends faster if you don't let it stay inside you." That night, Fritz thought about Marco's words. He imagined borders not as fences of wire, but as lines drawn in fear, lines that could be erased if one dared to see beyond them. As the days lengthened, Fritz noticed how the guards treated them with less formality now. They spoke freely, shared cigarettes, even exchanged small jokes. The line between captor and captive blurred, not from disobedience, but from exhaustion. Everyone was tired of pretending they were enemies. One evening, as the sky burned gold over the Texas plains, Jürgen said, "Do you think any of us will ever belong again?" Fritz looked toward the horizon, where the sun melted into the land. "Maybe not," he said, "but maybe belonging isn't a place anymore. Maybe it's what you carry." The wind stirred, carrying with it the hum of a distant train. Fritz felt its rhythm in his chest, a heartbeat of movement, of change. The world beyond the wire was shifting, and so was he. He didn't know where it would lead, only that the borders inside him had begun to break. Days turned into weeks, and Fritz found himself slipping into a strange kind of routine. The mornings were filled with work, repairing fences, tending to the garden, or sometimes helping the guards with small tasks. The evenings were quieter. The air would cool, and the sound of the camp would soften, leaving behind the hum of crickets and the occasional creak of wood settling in the barracks. Fritz had begun sketching again, though not the grand buildings he once dreamed of designing. His drawings were small now, focused on the little details of life around him. He sketched the way the sunlight hit the edge of a guard tower in the late afternoon, how the barbed wire caught the light at odd angles, the curvature of the barren trees outside the camp. Sometimes he drew people, like Tom with his boots and hat standing beside the grill, or Jürgen sitting on the edge of a wooden bench, his feet resting on the dirt. One evening, as Fritz sketched by the camp's wooden fence, Tom approached. "You're always drawing something," he said, glancing at the page in Fritz's hands. "You'll be running out of paper soon if you keep that up." Fritz smiled faintly, his pencil pausing for a moment. "I've started drawing things that matter," he replied quietly. "Small things." Tom tilted his head, his eyes thoughtful. "Like what?" Fritz motioned to the page. "This. The way the wire curves, the shadows. It's all part of the world, even if we don't always see it. If you look closely enough, it starts to make sense." Tom sat beside him on the ground, looking over his shoulder. "I never thought about the wire that way," he said. "Just something that keeps us in, I guess. Or keeps folks out." Fritz nodded, his gaze fixed on his sketch. "It's not just a line, though. It's part of everything here. It's where we are, what we do, and even how we think. I've been trying to see things beyond it." Tom was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "I think you've got a good way of looking at things, partner. Ain't no reason to forget where you are. But there's always a reason to look at it different." Fritz turned to him, his expression serious. "I'm not forgetting, Tom, but I think I've spent too long staring at the wrong parts. Maybe that's why I haven't figured out how to move forward." Tom smiled softly. "Forward's a long way off, but you keep drawing. You might just figure it out before you know it." That night, after the guards called for lights out, Fritz lay on his cot, the notebook tucked beneath his arm. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds, the low rustle of men shifting in their beds, the faint whistle of wind through cracks in the walls. The weight of his thoughts pressed on him, but now there was something else, something new. For the first time in months he felt a sense of purpose, a quiet drive to rebuild, not just with his hands but with his mind. He could still design, still create. Perhaps his life wasn't over. Perhaps it was just beginning in a way he hadn't expected. He opened the notebook and added a few more lines, sketching the curve of the wire against the horizon, the thin thread that connected the camp to the world beyond. And for a brief moment, he imagined what it would look like to tear it down, not with violence but with time, with understanding. The news came suddenly, through the crackling static of a small radio someone had hidden in the barracks. The guards were quieter than usual that morning, eyes shifting as if the weight of the announcement had not yet settled in their own hearts. "The war is over," the radio host's voice said, tinny and distant but carrying a strange finality. "Germany has surrendered. The Allies have won." Fritz stood frozen for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. It didn't feel real. Not after all the years of fighting, of hearing stories of what lay ahead, of surviving just to see the end. The words seemed to hang in the air, lingering like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Around him the other prisoners reacted in different ways. Some stood still, others whispered among themselves. But there was no celebration, no outcry, only a silence so thick it was almost painful. Jürgen, standing beside Fritz, turned slowly, his eyes distant. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. Fritz didn't answer immediately. He thought about the past, about the years he'd spent on the run, about the fear and the rage. He thought about home, about Dresden, the city that no longer existed in the way he remembered it, the family he had once hoped to return to. It was over, yes, the war was done. But what did that really mean? What did it mean for the men who had fought it, who had lost everything in it? What did it mean for the men who, like him, had survived only to find themselves in a place they didn't recognize, among people who had once been enemies? "We wait," Fritz finally said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "We wait and see what the world is like when it's finished with us." Tom Bailey, who had been standing off to the side, approached then. He was quiet, as if he too didn't know what to say. The hard lines in his face softened, and for a moment Fritz saw the weariness there, deeper than the dust on his boots or the smudges on his uniform. "Guess we all got to figure out what happens next," Tom said, his voice rough with an unspoken understanding. "But no matter where you go or what you do, you're still here. That means something." Fritz looked at him, feeling a strange sense of connection. He had hated the idea of this place, of being surrounded by men who had been his enemies. But in the silence after the war, there was something shared among them, a common bond forged in survival. Fritz nodded slowly. "It means something, but I don't know what yet." The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. The camp, once so controlled, began to unravel in quiet ways. The prisoners had their meals in silence, their work details softened, no longer with the urgency of an enemy to fight. The guards, too, seemed unsure of what to do. Their orders were vague, their presence lessened, as if they were waiting for someone else to tell them what to do next. And so the men waited. They waited for the war to finally end, for the world outside to offer them a place in it, for peace to somehow find its way into the broken spaces of their lives. But the war was over, and yet it had never truly left them. It lingered, like the smoke of a fire that refused to fade. And for Fritz, the question that loomed larger than ever was no longer about survival, but about how to rebuild when the pieces no longer fit together. The days that followed the news of Germany's surrender felt like a slow unraveling. The once rigid structure of Camp Herne had loosened. The guards, though still present, moved with a kind of detached weariness. The prisoners were no longer counted with urgency. There were no more strict rules, no more rushed movements. Time had turned elastic. Fritz spent his days in silence, working without the weight of fear pressing down on him. He still helped repair fences, still swept the grounds. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was all pointless now, that his hands had lost their meaning. But as the days passed, something small shifted inside him. He began to notice the way the light fell differently, the way the wind carried the dust across the yard in small swirls. He found himself sketching again, though now it wasn't buildings or streets. It was the land around him, the way the world outside the wire seemed to hold its breath. One afternoon, Fritz sat by the fence, pencil in hand, when Tom approached. He wasn't in uniform anymore. His clothes were faded, comfortable. He looked like a man who had been waiting for something, and now, finally, had permission to move. "You've been quiet, Weber," Tom said, squatting beside him. "What's going through that head of yours?" Fritz set the pencil down and looked at the sky. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Everything feels unfinished. The war's over, but I don't know where I belong anymore." Tom nodded, his expression soft. "I reckon that's a question for a lot of folks right now." He paused. "Where will you go when this is all over?" Fritz didn't answer at first. He had imagined returning to Dresden, rebuilding what had been lost, but now even that felt distant, unreachable. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't even know if I can go back." Tom leaned back on the grass, staring at the sky too. "You've been through a hell of a lot, Weber. Don't think there's any shame in not having all the answers." "Hell, I don't even know what I'm going to do when I get out of here. Maybe I'll get a place of my own, maybe I'll stay on the farm. Hell, maybe I'll head west. California's always been in my mind." Fritz turned to him, studying his face. Tom wasn't bothered by the unknown. He wasn't troubled by the future, not in the way Fritz was. For a moment, Fritz envied that ease. "You think you'll ever go back to the war?" Fritz asked quietly. Tom chuckled softly. "I think I'll leave that to the younger folks. War's never really over, you know. But I'm done with it." Fritz thought about that for a long time, his pencil tapping against the page. There was so much to rebuild, so much to reimagine. The past still clung to him like the dust on his boots, But somehow, with Tom sitting beside him in that quiet space, the future seemed just a little less frightening. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the camp, Fritz stood up and stretched. "Maybe I'll go to California too," he said, a tentative smile crossing his face. Tom grinned. "Hell, you might just end up liking it. But wherever you go, just make sure you're living, not just surviving." Fritz looked back at the camp one last time. The wire, the dust, the guards. It was all part of him now, but it didn't have to define him anymore. "I'll remember that," he said softly. "Maybe that's where I start." With that, the two men walked toward the gate, their boots kicking up the dust of the Texas soil. Neither of them had the answers, but for the first time in a long while, Fritz felt like he was walking toward something instead of away from it. The day arrived like any other, the sun climbing lazily over the horizon, casting a soft, golden light over the camp. But there was something different about this morning, something heavy in the air, anticipation. The last of the metal grills had been assembled the night before, and the smell of fresh bread and sizzling meat already began to drift through the barracks. It was the day of the final barbecue, the one that had started as a simple gesture and had somehow grown into a symbol of everything they had all endured. Fritz stood outside his barrack, looking out at the yard where the tables were being set up. Guards, once so stern and watchful, now moved with ease, chatting with the prisoners in a manner that was almost casual. The wire still surrounded them. The boundaries were still in place, but today it felt less like a prison and more like a gathering, a fleeting moment of peace. Jürgen appeared beside him, his face unreadable. "You think it will be like last time?" he asked, his voice low, carrying a hint of doubt. "I don't know," Fritz replied, his eyes scanning the preparations. "But it feels different this time. Like it means something." Jürgen's gaze followed his. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just another distraction before we're shipped out." Fritz turned to face him, his thoughts more complex than they had been in days. "I don't think it's a distraction. I think it's a reminder." Jürgen raised an eyebrow. "A reminder of what?" "Of what's still here," Fritz said, his voice steady but unsure. "Of the things that matter, even if they're fleeting." The wind picked up, stirring the dust in small, erratic whirlwinds. The smell of meat grew stronger, and Fritz felt his stomach growl. It had been weeks since the last decent meal, and the thought of the barbecue was oddly comforting. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the connection. About the moments of humanity, shared across wires that divided them. Tom walked over then, holding a plate of fresh bread. He grinned as he saw them. "Ready for the big feast?" he asked, handing a piece to Fritz. Fritz smiled faintly, taking the bread. "I'm not sure what to expect, but I'll take what I can." Tom's expression softened. "That's the spirit, partner. Take what you can. But today I reckon we all deserve a little something more than just survival." Fritz looked at him, the weight of his words settling on his chest. For all the years of hardship, all the suffering, Tom had found a way to embrace the little victories, the things that kept him alive even when it seemed like there was nothing left. As the barbecue began, the air thick with laughter and the smell of the roast, Fritz found himself sitting beside Tom, sharing a plate. For once, the past didn't seem so distant. For the first time, the wire, the fences, the rules, they didn't define him. The food, the company, the simple joy of a shared moment, those were what mattered. He looked around at the faces, the guards and prisoners alike, all sitting together, their differences momentarily forgotten. Otto's absence was noticeable, and for some, it was a relief. But for Fritz, it wasn't about the absence of one man. It was about the presence of many others, all of them choosing to be human, to share in something greater than the divisions between them. The music played on, and Fritz allowed himself to relax, to breathe. He couldn't explain why, but in that moment, he felt something stir deep inside, a fragile hope. The war had taken so much from him, from all of them, but perhaps, just perhaps, it hadn't taken everything. As the evening wore on and the stars began to dot the Texas sky, Fritz looked up, his thoughts quiet and his heart full. He knew the road ahead would be long, and there would be challenges still to face. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving, but living. And that, he thought, was worth more than any meal or any barbed wire.